haven't reached the level of sophistication we can genetically modify for certain traits and or states of an individual's sort of psychology or their cognition yet. But those things certainly are on the drawing board, in part because they also represent those techniques that might be viable in treating certain diseases or disorders of cognition, emotion, and behavior. But wait, there's even more. We can then go to the level of nanoscalar engineering and create devices that can be imported to the brain, if you will, implanted in the brain, utilizing very, very non-invasive or non-surgical techniques and technologies. This is the goal of a current ongoing project here in the United States. It's headed up by the Defense Advanced Research Project Agency, DARPA. It's called the N-Cubed program. N-Cubed being an acronym for Next Generation Non-Invasive Neuromodulation. It is, to my view, one of the most exciting brain science projects that I've seen evolve over the past 40 years. Because what it essentially does is allows the capability to introduce vast arrays of sensing and transmitting electrodes into the brain space without the need for neurosurgery. However, that's a huge Pandora's jar. I mean, what you're now doing is you're introducing electrodes into the brain capable of reading information from the living brain and writing information into the living brain in real time, remotely. And I don't care how you twist this around, shake this, or massage that. If we consider the functions of the living brain to be this thing that we call mind, that is mind reading and mind control. The question then is, what shall we do with this? Let me be very, very clear. There's absolutely nothing about the Neuralink device that represents anything technologically novel. In fact, in many ways, the Neuralink device itself is several orders of magnitude below the capability of the most sophisticated clinically utilized brain implant devices that are currently available for the medical market. What is different, however, about the Neuralink device are three things, and I think these portend some very interesting issues. Interesting, much the way our Chinese colleagues would talk about interesting as being both a blessing and a curse. And the third point that then raises some concern is whether or not the Neuralink device and Elon Musk, based upon his entrepreneurial spirit, is actually entertaining, if not fostering, what is soon to become an international market for neuromedical tourism. But you don't want to be a Pollyanna. Let's not be naive. Limits are always transgressed. They're either transgressed in those ways that work within the parameters of limitations themselves. In other words, they find hooks, loopholes, or there are those that simply don't care for whatever reason. And as a result, things occur outside the limits, which is something we need to be equally prepared for. Okay, now we're encouraging medical tourism. You want Neuralink? Go to country X because they'll give you Neuralink. They'll implant it and they'll provide you with the necessary soft and hardware. But then we also have to consider what that then does to the global bioeconomy, and also what other levels of quality control that are now being utilized and implemented with not only the implantation of Neuralink, but where the data that Neuralink is collecting and what data Neuralink is able to then provide back into that living brain are being custodialized. In other words, who's got the keys to the cognitive kingdom here? Now you get into a whole bunch of other potential issues, not least of which is quality control and public health, but you're also getting involved with some issues of what may be biosecurity, biopower, bioinfluence. And this opens up, as I said, a proverbial Pandora's jar. All of these things need to at least be addressed directly and explicitly as we recognize this technology being realized ever more capably on the global stage. But even those what we've considered to be viable uses are laden with ethical and legal issues, each of which need to be considered before, during, and even after these things are developed. These things are not yet developed. You can already hear what your audience is saying. Wait a minute. This is DARPA, and the D in DARPA stands for Darth Vader, so they're already dropping these things in people's heads. I'm here to tell you, To the best of my knowledge, these things are not being dropped into people's heads. These things aren't being made into little aerosols you can then spray into a room, and now everyone has these electrodes. The government is controlling their brain. But is that possible? Would that be possible? Yes. Which is why I don't discourage what I will call collective republic concern. But what I do encourage is to avoid neuro nonsense. Let's be very, very concerned about the actual capabilities that science and technology possess, inclusive of their evolution over the next 5 years. Let's be really concerned about that. Let's be concerned to the point of who's controlling the technology. Is it being commercialized? How is it being commercialized? And all the issues that go along with that. Let's not sort of forego the idea of worrying about the rain and the possibility of a real storm by confusing ourselves with saying the sky is falling. The sky isn't falling, but it looks like rain. 2024, there are plenty of things we can do to be able to modulate the patterns of activity of the living brain in a given individual so as to modify various aspects of their thoughts, emotions, and ultimately behaviors. That is doable. That's not science fiction. That is science fact. Well, what are certain research practices that have benevolent intent, but that could go bad like that? Case in point, something like gain of function research that, as I'm sure you and all of your listeners now know, was at least contributory in part to the possibility of developing the form of the SARS virus that ultimately led to COVID. Do we have the constraints in place? Do we have the safeguards in place? If they're in place, are they ratified? Are they surveilled? Are they maintained? Are they governed? All of these things, I think, need to come to the fore as part of the internationalizable discourse and reality as the science and technology becomes ever more capable, and not only ever more capable, but in some cases, we become more culpable or at least complicit in the way the science and technology is used, not used, misused, or abused. What's going to be necessary to be able to be aware of this, stay aware of the science, the real science? Look, science fiction is wonderful. And I've been a big fan of science fiction since I was a little kid, still am. But I think what becomes very important is you can get lost in the science fiction, and as a consequence, you get distracted from science fact. Let's stay focal on the science fact for that which is going to be our exercise and our effort. And let's use the science fiction as viable entertainment, but also as illustration of what could be possibilities if the science fact gets out of hand. Not to necessarily impart worry on your listening audience, but rather to appraise them of the reality of the situation, which is not simple. It is indeed complex. And let's face it, complex questions and issues require detailed and complex solution sets. And so there is no easy fix. It's going to take work. But at the end of the day, I've argued in print, and I'll do so here again unapologetically, I truly think that the juice is worth the squeeze.
Welcome everybody to Health Alliance Australia. My name is Jenny Rose Anschwather, and I'm here with Professor James Giordano. Health Alliance Australia is the leading health advocacy organisation in Australia, greatly concerned about the weaponisation of medicine and science for political power and harm. We are dedicated to honouring bodily autonomy and well-informed health choices. We provide health information on our website, healthallianceaustralia.org, and through our podcast. You can subscribe to our newsletter, donate or join as a member. We have asked Professor Giordano here today to discuss a very important field topic on the field of neuroscience, which for those of you who have never heard of it before may sound a bit like the works of science fiction. The technology of neuroscience has rapidly developed. Brain science is the Wild West with incredible potential and huge risks. It has both civilian and military applications. In medicine, multiple applications from treatments for neurological diseases, spinal injuries, to using gene editing and CRISPR and Neuralink implants. Huge ethical considerations and cross-cultural boundaries, and if weaponized, has frightening possibilities, but also could be used for positive social change. Just like AI, it will change the course of human evolution, and there is no going back. The question, if not, if we can do it, but should we, and who decides that? Professor James Giordano has an impressive and extensive list of qualifications and achievements. I will link to his bio in the description and on the Health Alliance Australia website. Professor Giordano, welcome today. Thank you for coming. Can you please just give us a brief introduction of yourself and how you got into the neuroscience field?
Well, sure. Thanks very much. It's a real pleasure to be here. And thank you very much, and to your audience, for your interest in my work. I've been a brain scientist for about 42 years this year, which makes me feel incredibly old. I'm currently the Pellegrino Center Professor of the Departments of Neurology and Biochemistry at Georgetown University Medical Center in Washington, D.C., where I also head up the Neuroethics Studies program as part of the Pellegrino Center for Clinical Bioethics, and also serve as co-director of our program in brain science and global health policy and law. As well, I work with a number of governments worldwide, mostly NATO governments, as well as Japanese government, to be able to advise in certain areas of the use of brain science, obviously in biomedicine, for social welfare and public health, but also to counsel on the possibility, as you very well pointed out, that the brain sciences, like so many other domains of science and technology, do have the potential to be used for, if not capricious means, in other ways that might be nefarious intent. And so I think if we just take your introduction earlier and just kind of flip that around, it becomes far more relevant. I mean, the intent of developing and utilizing neuroscience and its technologies is towards the low-hanging fruit of being able to offer relative goods to humans, to better the human predicament of disease, injury, suffering illness, and even those predicaments whereby we find ourselves somewhat constrained by certain things that may be congenital or simply as a consequence of our lifespan and finitude. As well, I mean, I think there are plenty of things that could be offered that can then provide optimization in key areas, not only to facilitate our survival, which is certainly primary, it's the low-hanging fruit, if you will, of biomedicine, but also to advance our flourishing. I mean, how good is good? Is it just that we prevent, for example, our own decrement and demise, or should we be better at the things we do? We're tool users, and we use those tools to make ourselves better in a variety of different ways. But here you get into a really interesting, somewhat conundrum. What definition of good? Yours? Mine? Someone else's? And what we necessarily view as good, while we view maybe something that is very defensible, we like to defend our way of life against any potential harms or threats, whether they're foreign or domestic. Well, the issue then is, well, what does that then portend for the use of science and technology, inclusive of the brain sciences, to be developed as potential means of contending against others who we may view to then affront, burden, or threaten what we hold to be ideologically or existentially our goods. And that then gets us into the whole idea of if and how brain sciences could be used in those ways that are leverageable for national security, intelligence, and defense preparations and operations.
So, I mean, you've described the brain as the battlefield of the future. Now, often people would think of the brain as part of their thinking, as part of who they are, like their thoughts are essentially, I think, therefore I am. So in some ways, how would you describe it that, that people could be influenced in such a way by this technology that their thoughts no longer become theirs? Where is that line between what is that, the social good of, say, influencing a large proportion of the population to believe in a certain ideas because it is for their good? Let's say, for example, someone had false or misleading ideas due to their own upbringing, their own experience, and it was possible to influence a large proportion of the population to believe in something that was, could be seen as for the community good, for example. So where does that line draw? Is that what you're describing as the battlefield of the future, that we're actually trying to get a consensus, or no?
No. So you have to back this up several notches before you get to the idea of a battlefield of the future.
Yeah.
I mean, let's take this step by step, and then we can see how one thing potentially could evolve into the other. And what we're really looking at is a spectrum of applications rather than a binary black or white. Right?
Mm-hmm.
So first and foremost, I agree with you. I mean, I think that there's something to be said for the idea that the brain is at least participatory in our identity. I mean, our identity is not simply our brains. I mean, as I said, I've been a neuroscientist for over 4 decades. And I really don't think that that any neuroscientist is going to tell you that you can take the brain out of the body and then have an identity within that brain.
Mm,
That brain grew up in that body, and that body grew up embedded and influenced by its environments. You simply cannot extricate those two. And as a result, what we're seeing is that, yeah, the brain and the nervous system is certainly involved in our embodied and our environmental and social identity. And it represents a very important cog. Now, where we are in the brain sciences right now is that there's an ongoing effort over the past couple of decades to try to identify those nodes and networks in the brain that may be participatory in the way we feel about ourselves, about our sense of self, about what that then means to have an identity, and then what that might then mean if those brain areas are accessed and affected. How does our identity change, for example, under certain neurological conditions? How are our cognitions influenced by brain structures and functions? How does disease and injury affect the brain? And are those aspects of the brains being affected in those abnormal ways, or what we define to be abnormal ways, then not only accessible, but amenable to the tools that we have at our disposal to be able to, quote, treat or repair an injured brain?
mm,
Now, clearly from that point, I think the next step is, yeah, but why should we stop at injury or insult? I mean, look, we have a whole area of medicine that's considered to be preventive medicine. And preventive medicine essentially works before any incurment of injury or disease to keep us well, to keep us healthy, and in some cases to enable us to do certain things that allow us occupational and avocational protections, capabilities, and to enable us to do the things we'd like to do better or best. So the question then becomes, could we not utilize these aspects of brain sciences also to assess how and where in the brain certain nodes and networks may be involved with our various aspects of cognitive, emotional, and behavioral performance, decision making, etc., in a variety of different applications, our jobs, our private lives, our avocations, our hobbies? The answer to all these questions is yes. In fact, we are using the brain sciences in those ways. But now here's where we really enter a gray zone. We have two things that come up to the fore. Number one, if we're looking at the brain sciences to treat and or perhaps reverse particularly neurological conditions that we, whoever we may be, view as abnormal, what is the standard of normality we're using? Are we using the brain sciences to define that normality? Well, that sort of becomes kind of circular reasoning. We're using the tools to define what is normal, and then we're using those tools to essentially establish that normality. Caution needs to be exercised strongly as we interpret the results of the brain sciences to then create and sustain what may be social normativity, social norms, social mores, standards, for example. We also have to be very, very careful about what we consider to be a pathology. The idea of defining something to be pathologic takes on huge socio-political value and in some cases vehemence. And there's certainly historiographical evidence of that. One need only take a look, for example, at here in the United States, the pseudo-diagnosis of dropsy-tomania. In other words, that all individuals of color have certain psychological characteristics that are based upon their neurological structure. We can point our finger overseas from the United States, for example, very easily and talk about those things that have occurred in Nazi Germany, for example, Soviet Russia, for example, and on and on. And so the idea of politicizing pathologies to those who do not conform to a particular collective ideal, whether that is community or whether that's political, can be very, very dangerous. But then let's go one step further. What you then brought up is, well, why shouldn't we use the neurosciences in those ways that can assess those brain structures and function that make us happier, better, and target those things to be able to eradicate, if not prevent or mitigate, certain aspects of disease, disorder, condition? In other words, why just stop at the human predicament? Why not, in fact, engage the human condition? And we do, not just with the brain sciences, we do it uniformly with any form of science and technology. I mean, let's face it, in the 1800s, the idea of using technology axiomatically was to make human life easier, to make ourselves more available to our various liberties, freedoms that we could then use creatively. whether we've actually done that or not, I think represent an entirely different construct and certainly room for another conversation. But that implicit, if not explicit intent of using technologies for what we hold to be, quote, good persists. The trouble, as I mentioned, is defining what good, by whose justification, according to what criteria. Realistically, what rationality can we then use? And is what is good for, quote, me or mine, my kin and kith, my collective, equivalently, if not equally good, applicable and therefore enforceable or at least entertainable on others? Is there some universal standard? The answer to those questions is a resolving no. There is no universal standard because the neurosciences are becoming worldwide, and therefore we must appreciate that in various cultures and communities, the meanings of the neurosciences and its relative validity and value can differ. The question then becomes, are we ready to deal with that? Are we ready to discourse that? Are we ready to engage in the appropriate dialectic that may not necessarily allow for uniformity, but certainly encourages something that's synthetic? That's my hope. That's what our work is trying to achieve together with our international colleagues. It's a work in progress.
Yes. And I guess that would mean, a convergence of culture in some ways, if this is what the aim is. I mean, how can you, if you've got cultures that are very collective, so they may choose to use brain science in a way that would encourage more, uniform thinking, whereas in the West, we value a lot of Western ideas of individuality. So how does that fit in when, for example, what you're talking about here is if we are we talking about increasing the IQ of people? Like if for example, they're born, they might have had some sort of injury during the birth. They may have, genetically lower IQ. Is the desire for brain science to make everyone uniformly the same, or continue to upgrade essentially like you would upgrade a computer, the human brain? And where does that go? And if various countries are all competing economically and socially on those parameters, then there is no limit. There is no upper limit for what people will want to achieve with brain science.
Well, yes and no. I mean, I think that what you very well described are the regnant anxieties, right? The possibilities of what could be. But let's back that up a step if we could. It's not a slippery slope. It's a slope, without a doubt, but a slippery slope is one that is unmitigable. And I think that there are means and I think there are methods of mitigation, not least of which is discourse. And not just discourse, but as I said earlier, dialectic, where you have position A and you have position B. And what is necessarily viable, value, and defensible for position A, given position A's norms, values, standards, histories, may not necessarily comport with position B. And that may be fine if we can maintain those things in A, within A, and maintain those things within B. In other words, what I'll call intracultural or intra-sociocultural use of the brain sciences. But the reality is that we live in an ever more globalized world. And what I mean by globalized is exchange of ideas, information, capabilities, sometimes cooperatively, very often competitively, and sometimes that competition can lead to combatively. The question then becomes, what is that measure of cooperative competition, referred to colloquially as coopetition, a real term that affords certain interrelations and dependencies and checks and balances, but that also affords particular liberties within sociocultures to exercise and entertain their values, but do so in ways that are not necessarily infringing upon and or intruding upon those of others. Is there a universal good? I think that's debatable. Are there, however, capabilities and methods by which collectives can come together within their operational spheres and milieu to define what is acceptable or non-acceptable, given those constraints and parameters of interaction? Yes, absolutely. And here I laud some of the very impressive work that was done a few years ago by the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, as you know, an international organization that has offices both in Paris, France, and in the United States. And they brought together, literally in roundtable discussion, very dialectically, individuals from across the globe in a variety of different cultures, not only exclusive to, quote, the West, as it used to be called, but also a number of Asian cultures. The reason being is that neuroscience is increasingly a multinational enterprise. And as such, the histories, the narratives, the values of those various cultures need to be appreciated, I think, respected, and therefore responded to in those ways that bring them together as part of that collective, that global collective of neuroscientific capability. So I'm optimistically guarded that the possibilities exist for this reality to occur. But I think, as with anything, there are always going to be tripping hazards. And as a consequence of those tripping hazards, various tipping points that could then take the discourse, the dialectic, and the direction in those ways that become somewhat more problematic rather than promising.
So, what are the tools that we currently have with neuroscience in order to augment or change and alter the brain? Like, what currently do we, where does the science actually stand right now at the moment?
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, so literally, we're going to be almost grounded to this point of time because interestingly, what we find is that the brain sciences and its technologies evolve pretty quickly.
Mm.
It used to be that this pattern of evolution, if you will, that goes from concept to a usable construct, in other words, it goes from thought to tool, took somewhere between 15 and 20 years, no longer. I mean, realistically, the capability of utilizing big data together with machine learning, together with the ability to utilize what's now known as integrative scientific convergence, where a variety of the physical, natural, life, and even social sciences come together to address and solve problems, has really created something of an omnibus of capability that has now shortened the time course between idea and reality. So now what we're really looking at is an evolution somewhere between 48 to 60 calendar months within the brain sciences for a concept to become construct, for it to become a tool, if you will. And I think one of the ways we're seeing this is when we're looking towards various aspects of neuroscience that then become developmental towards various technologies and how the technologies then enable science. So what you're seeing is an interesting reciprocity between the tools we have and the theories we have. In some cases, the tools allow us to develop certain theories and develop our knowledge and insight. We come to the limits of that knowledge and insight, and then we have the need to develop new, more capable tools. And then very often with the tools we have at hand, we develop new tasks. In other words, we have the tools, let's dig deeper into what these task spaces are, these task capabilities are. That said, in general, we can take a look at the neurosciences and neurotechnologies and categorize them into three interactive domains. There are the neuroscientific and technological capabilities for assessing the brain. These include things like electroencephalography, various forms of neuroimaging, in their variant forms that are increasingly being used in ways that are co-registered. In other words, taken together rather than just using one technique or the other. We can couple that to various forms of genomic and genetic and proteomic assessment, the use of various biomarkers that are correlative. And what are we using these things to do? Essentially, we're using these to there's no way around it, map those neurological structures on a variety of levels, from the things that are the cellular to the systemic in the brain and within the body, that are contributory, if not operative, in various patterns of our thought, our feelings, and our behaviors. Well, mapping is one thing. And what do we use maps for? Well, we know what we use maps for. We use maps to get somewhere. What are we looking to get? We're looking to get into those targets and affect those targets in viable ways. Understanding how those various brain targets at a variety of levels, in some cases structural, in other cases functional, in all cases interactively, are affected by disease, injury, are involved in our various patterns of thought, feeling, and actions and behaviors. And then what that means individually and collectively, and then to affect those in ways that decrease the burden of injury, disease, various conditions, that can increase our various capabilities of thought, emotion, and activity. So we're essentially using brain mapping to develop ever more sophisticated, ever more granular, and therefore ever more capable and precise targets that can be affected in a variety of ways, which now brings us to the second domain of neuroscience and technology, which are referred to as the interventional methods. And these include things such as drugs that are becoming ever more sophisticated, ever more specific and precise, because the more we know about the brain and what constitutes the brain on a variety of levels, from the subcellular all the way to the systemic, the more, in fact, we can create interventions that are capable, that go from the cellular to the social, from the individual to the international, if you will. Our drugs are becoming far more selective, not only in terms of what they can do pharmacologically, but also in terms of the pharmaceutics. In other words, how we are getting drugs into the brain compartment in ways that are far more sharp shot rather than buckshot, which allows for a much greater level of precision and personalization in what the effects are and in the diminution of what might be side effects or unwanted effects. We're also utilizing a whole host of various devices that utilize low-level electrical current that can be applied to the surface of the head. These are called the transcranial electrical and magnetic stimulatory neuromodulatory capabilities and technologies. We're also utilizing certain things that access those nerve systems that occur in the spinal cord, go up to the brain, for example, vagal nerve stimulation and peripheral nerve stimulation. And of course, we're also then engaging a far more sophisticated and very, very precise form of targeting, which is known as deep brain stimulation. In other words, indwelling placement of microelectrodes within the brain structure to be able to target and modify the activity of very, very precise nodes and therefore networks of the brain in directional ways. Now, of course, this is a capability that has been available literally for decades. Deep brain stimulation, indwelling brain stimulation has had a fairly rich 25-year plus history. And much of the work that we're doing with our international colleagues as part of the deep brain stimulation think tank has in fact pioneered those techniques. They become very, very sophisticated, much more detailed, smaller, more compact, and ever more capable, not only in their compactness, but also in their range of competence in terms of what the actual electrodes are capable of doing, the programmability of those electrodes, open and closed loop systems, and how we model the biophysics of where we target in the brain to be very, very accurate. Do they have potential side effects? Everything has potential side effects. Are these side effects mitigable? Yes, absolutely. Are we also incurring certain problems within the social and or healthcare administrations as to who gets these goodies and why? Yeah, without a doubt. And I must tell you, we're also seeing the advent of certain other techniques and technologies, as you alluded to earlier. The use of gene editing techniques allow now for in vivo, real-time modification of brain genomes, of the genetic capabilities of certain brain cells that then would differentially allow the expression or non-expression of certain disease types, as well as cell types, systems types. These can be directional as well. We haven't reached the level of sophistication we can genetically modify for certain traits and or states of an individual's sort of psychology or their cognition yet. But those things certainly are on the drawing board, in part because they also represent those techniques that might be viable in treating certain diseases or disorders of cognition, emotion, and behavior. But wait, there's even more. We can then go to the level of nanoscalar engineering and create devices that can be imported to the brain, if you will, implanted in the brain, utilizing very, very non-invasive or non-surgical techniques and technologies. This is the goal of a current ongoing project here in the United States. It's headed up by the Defense Advanced Research Project Agency, DARPA. It's called the N-Cubed program. N-Cubed being an acronym for Next Generation Non-Invasive Neuromodulation. It is, to my view, one of the most exciting brain science projects that I've seen evolve over the past 40 years. Because what it essentially does is allows the capability to introduce vast arrays of sensing and transmitting electrodes into the brain space without the need for neurosurgery. However, that's a huge Pandora's jar. I mean, what you're now doing is you're introducing electrodes into the brain capable of reading information from the living brain and writing information into the living brain in real time remotely. And I don't care how you twist this around, shake this, or massage that. If we consider the functions of the living brain to be this thing that we call mind, that is mind reading and mind control. The question then is, what shall we do with this? But let's take one step to the left, if we could, or to the right, depending on your perspective. Not politically, but just depending on
Yes.
your orientation. We now also have an interesting direct-to-consumer market. We've had a direct-to-consumer market for the non-implantable brain technologies for well over a decade. Direct-to-consumer availability of transcranial electrical stimulatory and modulatory devices, that's been a given. However, what appears to be a sentinel change in the field is being pioneered by Elon Musk, and this is Neuralink. Let me be very, very clear. There's absolutely nothing about the Neuralink device that represents anything technologically novel. In fact, in many ways, the Neuralink device itself is several orders of magnitude below the capability of the most sophisticated clinically utilized brain implant devices that are currently available for the medical market. What is different, however, about the Neuralink device are three things. And I think these portend some very interesting issues. Interesting, much the way our Chinese colleagues would talk about interesting as being both a blessing and a curse. First, the idea here is that the Neuralink device is not necessarily being promulgated or advanced to treat particular disorders. In other words, per Elon Musk, at least in the initial rhetoric, everyone should have Neuralink because this is the way we can capabilize humanity against the rise of the proverbial machines. That at best is hype and at worst is nothing more than sheer exaggeration. But it is very entrepreneurial. The idea is that everyone needs one. And when you put that bug in someone's head, literally, as well as figuratively, now you've started a relative steamroller of effect. Point number one. Point number two, this is a highly commercial enterprise. And if, in fact, this is a device that is no more sophisticated, if in fact less sophisticated than currently available devices, what neurosurgeon will then, in fact, advocate the use of this device to treat a particular neurological condition? The truth of the answer is very few, if any. Part of the allure of the Neuralink device is that it's specifically oriented to be a brain computational interface that allows externalization of brain function to therefore control a variety of things. Moving a mouse on a computer, opening your garage doors, turning your stove on, whatever. The question then becomes, well, who needs that? Well, one could argue that individuals who have profound neurological debilitation could use something like that. The Neuralink device does not represent the state of the art in the capacity to do so. There are other devices on the market internationally that are far more capable in those regards. But where the Neuralink device opens up a unique niche is as a market tool. If in fact I wanted to have this capability, but I didn't need it, could I get a Neuralink device? Well, at this point, that's a gray zone. The Neuralink device has recently been approved by the Food and Drug Administration as an investigational device, which therefore gets certain exemptions because it is similar, if not identical, to other devices that can be used in exceptional cases. But here's a scenario for you. Given the amount of revenue that Neuralink and its founder possess, the idea of developing Neuralink clinics that are proprietary clinics, that are commercial clinics, where one goes, for example, to have physicians who are employed by Neuralink that have, for example, institutional review boards that are under the employ of Neuralink, therefore that answer ethically to those institutional review boards, then sets up Neuralink as a commercial entity that is available directly to the consumer. And one might say, wait. Hold it. I don't really see that happening given certain regulations with the Food and Drug Administration in the United States and its equivalent organizations worldwide. I simply don't see that happening, for example, with the Federal Trade Commission, et cetera. There are a number of, if you will, administrative, institutional, and organizational proscriptions against that type of thing, but they're not global. And the third point that then raises some concern is whether or not the Neuralink device and Elon Musk, based upon his entrepreneurial spirit, is actually entertaining, if not fostering, what is soon to become an international market for neuromedical tourism. In other words, establishing Neuralink clinics outside of those domiciles, outside of those particular constituencies, that would control them to more permissive jurisdictions, such as where? Well, I mean, there are several. Take a look at current aspects of medical tourism, whereby certain rules and regulations are not identical to where they are in other countries, and that allows certain flexibilities. So what you then see is, okay, now we're encouraging medical tourism. You want Neuralink? Go to country X because they'll give you Neuralink. They'll implant it and they'll provide you with the necessary soft and hardware. But then we also have to consider what that then does to the global bioeconomy and also what other levels of quality control that are now being utilized and implemented with not only the implantation of Neuralink, but where the data that Neuralink is collecting and what data Neuralink is able to then provide back into that living brain are being custodialized. In other words, who's got the keys to the cognitive kingdom here? Now you get into a whole bunch of other potential issues, not least of which is quality control and public health, but you're also getting involved with some issues of what may be biosecurity, biopower, bioinfluence. And this opens up, as I said, a proverbial Pandora's jar. All of these things need to at least be addressed directly and explicitly as we recognize this technology being realized ever more capably on the global stage.
So essentially, you're talking about regulation. It's like basically, if Neuralink is going to end up being an unregulated product that can go anywhere in the world, then the competitive thing is it could go anywhere. We lose control of the ethics, the whole, as you were talking about before, an agreement, I guess, trying to come to that collective understanding of where and how we use this technology in a way that is positive. We can no longer have that if we are to commercialize it, because in commercial interests will just run where the money goes.
Not necessarily. I mean, I think that there's always the latitude and capability for the engagement of ethics, even in an entrepreneurial exercise. Right? Where we get to be a little, where it gets to be a little gray in terms of the what's called zone definition, is that ethics must be about the endeavor. It must be about the effort. I mean, look, one of the big problems we're having in medicine is that the contemporary ethics of medicine, and I'm speaking primarily from the United States, because the orientation in terms of the interaction between laws, ethics, and policy is focal to my jurisdiction here in the States. The ethics of medicine, in many ways, has been superseded by the ethics of business. And in some cases, the ethics of business is about profit. It's about sort of the commercial entity, right? Proprietary entity. That's not to say the ethics of business does not in any way uphold the integrity of the individual who may be the consumer or the client, but the consumer and the client is not philosophically or literally the same as the patient. There's a very, very different level of asymmetry and a very, very different level of dependence that exists between a consumer client and a patient. And if in fact the ethos is one oriented toward an end goal of profit for business, that's not the same as the ethos where the end goal is a right and good care of this individual person who is in the predicament of being a vulnerable patient. That's not to say they're incompatible. There are certainly models and mechanisms that have been proposed, in some cases have been enacted, that very well align the business aspect of medicine and biomedical, both research and care, with its, if you will, therapeutic and humanitarian dimensions. It's possible, but that takes effort, both a priori, in other words, before you even get into the enterprise, and during. In other words, during and ongoing requires continuous alignment between those ends that are intentional and the ethics that are used to both support the means and the ends themselves. So I don't think it's impossible to be able to have business enterprises in the neurosciences and technologies, even on a worldwide basis, that are distinct from an underlying ethics that allows for consideration of, if you will, sort of the bioethics of the individual, not necessarily even a patient, but who is a person, and what that then means. Certain things may be very entertainable within cultures, but not between cultures. So I think those ethical discussions need to be very specific, very precise, and granular as to the context in which this particular effort is going to be engaged, entertained, and utilized. So again, I think it's possible. I'm optimistic, but I'm also pragmatic that it's going to take some work, and that work requires funding. And funding, well, that's always the sticky wicket, isn't it? So,
Yeah, I mean, I'm thinking about the
yeah.
applications of this. I mean, militarily, you could have super soldiers. You could use this in prisons, for example. I mean, where does the whole line of, course, we've talked about people with neurological issues, schizophrenia, perhaps we could,
Mhm.
tweak their brains so they could live a normal life. But
You've raised a really interesting and I think hugely provocative, if not contentious point. Right. And so this is some of the work certainly of our group, and there are others internationally. I mean, here I cite some of the very interesting work of a colleague of mine from Mexico, Dr. Karen Herrera Ferra, who's talked about the use of neuroscience and technology to define recurrent violent behavior. Right? To define that on multiple levels, to define it biologically as well as psychosocial culturally, and then utilize that information in those ways that are important to both medicine and the law. And we too have worked with the idea of what can neuroscience do to better align with the needs of the law. And again, the law is not something that is necessarily universal. Laws occur characteristically within national sovereignties, right? And you have to be careful as to whose law and to what sovereignty. Here you get into whole issues once again, the Nazi state, the former Soviet state, and the misuse of science and technology and medicine to pathologize those that are essentially socially discordant, and therefore not call them criminals, but call them patients that need to be, quote, treated, wink, wink, nudge, nudge, in ways that are essentially, if you will, socio-political lobotomizations. And I'm being metaphorical, not literal. But I mean, here's an interesting point. What about the idea of neurocorrectives? Now, just by saying that, I mean, I'm sure the hair on your listener's neck is standing on edge, as it should be, as it should be. But let's weigh both sides of the balance, because I don't think that what's going to happen is you're going to get that equilibration of balance until there's some at least consensus on what is permissible and what isn't and why. So if we take a look, for example, at the prison system, let's just take a look solely at the United States. And arguably, it is a prison system that in many ways requires repair, right? Is it effective? Does it actually rehabilitate, et cetera? How much money goes into the prison system, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And then on the other side, well, there are many people who are employed by the prison system, so you have jobs, boom, boom, okay, fine. But if the goal here truly is not just retributive justice, but some form of recuperative justice, whereby individuals are then rehabilitated to be able to have some, quote, social value, then we have to ask, is this system effective? Is it efficient? Very often the question comes up and says, no. Could we do more? Well, perhaps. Could we take certain individuals who have transgressed the law and, with their consent, provide certain neurological, whether these are neuroscientific and or neurotechnological interventions that alter their cognitions, their emotions, and behaviors so as to make them more, quote, socially compatible, or at very, very least, non-threatening and dangerous to self and others? The short answer to that question is yes. The long answer is, what, are you kidding me? Seriously? Because even if we consider the possibility for their consent, we have to then consider the implicit nature of, is that coercive or not? What are we really offering them? And the other issue is, will we provide for them the continuity of research and clinical care, not should things go wrong, but when things go wrong? Because I'm here to tell you, as well as there's a giant Italian nose on my face, that things will go wrong. And the reason for it is threefold. Number one, we're only able to see the benefits of what it is we're doing before us. Very often, the burdens and or the risks, threats, and harms occur as a question of evolution, what we call insight to. In other words, once you do something, you then get the ball rolling, and that's a problem. So in other words, we can't encounter these issues until they occur, number one. Number two, the more diverse the population of individuals into which these treatments are being rendered, the highly more probable the likelihood for diversity of effects, if not immediately, then down the road. And number three, do we have the civic institutions in place and operationalizable to be able to deal with these contingencies? In other words, do we have the mechanisms in place to be able to appropriately treat, regard, and care for those individuals who we, quote, neurocorrect to now become contributory members of society? And the short answer to that question is no. So if in fact you don't have the resources that are there for the continuity of research and interventional clinical care, nor do you have the civic institutions that are aligned and operationally ready to go, don't go there. But wait, just because I, Jim Giordano, are telling you in Australia that we shouldn't go there, and we both proverbially fist bump on a screen and go, good idea, doesn't mean that it won't happen elsewhere. The question then becomes, well, is that mitigable? In other words, given the fact that not everyone sings off the same sheet of proverbial music, can we at least create some method of conducting various scores given heterogeneity of orchestras? And that becomes, I think, more of a puzzle to be solved rather than a mystery to ponder. I mean, what is it going to take to be able to define those particular contexts within specific collectives of individuals whereby the neurosciences can be used in certain ways, in certain individuals, for definable goods by consensus? Consensus within that collective does not in any way guarantee, assure, or sustain consensus between collectives or in a more universal global collective. So the nature of the discourse must be focal, must be local, must appreciate cosmopolitan views and values, but must also be flexible enough to maintain some relative fixity and purpose. And that fixity and purpose is that there are going to be definable limits. We have to define what those limits are, and in those various contexts, work within them. But you don't want to be a Pollyanna. Let's not be naive. Limits are always transgressed. They're either transgressed in those ways that work within the parameters of limitations themselves. In other words, they find hooks, loopholes, or there are those that simply don't care for whatever reason. And as a result, things occur outside the limits, which is something we need to be equally prepared for. And being prepared means we have to model these things. We have to understand the nature of what might be these various deviations that can occur on a variety of levels, both idiosyncratically as well as systemically. And we have to have certain mechanisms in place to respond to these so that there can be the necessary governance, oversight, and guidance. And that can be a problem.
I mean, you can imagine that, regimes who would want to have their political prisoners reprogrammed, who dissidents, it would be able to use this technology in such a way that we would not agree with, but how there would be no way of stopping it. And I was thinking in terms of, it doesn't seem all that efficient if you're just targeting one person at a time, if you're only able to provide that service or transformation to one. That wouldn't the dream of, say, if someone wanted to do a population-wide, would be able to achieve it wirelessly across population. I mean, isn't that the dream here? Whether you want to see that as for social good, like to have this whole society programmed as like a hive mind, or whether you could use it as like a regime would like to have all their people all in line, no dissidents, no need for prisons. I mean, is this?
You're right. Face value, it's two sides of the same coin. On one side of this coin, it's a utopian vision where we're thinking, oh my gosh, we could utilize the brain sciences and these technologies to create individuals who are, if you will, more morally capable, more morally responsive. Yeah, but what is morality? I mean, is there truly a universally definable morality? I mean, there have been philosophers such as Bernard Goethe and Klaus Dane who've looked at this idea. I mean, Goethe's construct of a common morality, I think, is based upon 5 key elements and then 5 derivative elements. And I think those are relatively stable But the truth of it is, rarely are things completely equal in all certain circumstances, number one. And number two, well, if those provide the basis, the groundwork for what a common morality would be, how are these things actually executable given the contingencies and exigencies of what I'll call the sort of quotidian real world practices? And the truth of the issue is they vary, right? So given Klauser Daner's stuff, given Bernie Gert's stuff, what we can say is, yeah, the idea of a common morality may represent, I think, a great ideal that is certainly the stuff of philosophical discourse and debate, but that doesn't represent the fabric of something we can knit into something that's guidable and governable in real world situations, at least not uniformly yet. Point number one. Point number two, you're absolutely right. And the question then becomes what is not only tolerable, but what is permissible? And the things are not necessarily the same. What a given society or culture will permit also, I think, allows certain latitudes on what is then tolerable under that level of permissivity. If I permit certain latitudes, you know as well as I that very often what tends to happen is you keep pushing up against that boundary of permissibility to try to expand what is tolerable or not. And then the big question becomes, all right, so let's just say we're doing these things. And these things are totally capable at this point in time. 2024, there are plenty of things we can do to be able to modulate the patterns of activity of the living brain in a given individual so as to modify various aspects of their thoughts, emotions, and ultimately behaviors. That is doable. That's not science fiction. That is science fact. The question then becomes, who gets these things? Let's just say for a moment that what we're talking about is some utopia, a utopian vision. Who gets these things? Who gets the quote goodies if, in fact, by consensus in a community, we all think these are good things? We use them to make ourselves more capable in certain ways, more vigilant in certain ways, more resistant, more responsive, perhaps more recuperable for a variety of things. And that allows us to be more resilient, if you will, and therefore perhaps even more socially engaged, more socially competent. And if we view morality as nothing more than a group's sort of collective ideas and ideals about what represents good behavior so as to let people get along, well, once there's consensus, let's just make people do those things if we can. There is no particular nucleus in the brain that we can stimulate to make people more moral. But could we, in fact, at least influence their behavioral expressions? Could we perhaps provide certain thresholds or patterns of brain activities that are discernible and then keep brain activities within those patterns of discernibility? Yeah, we could do that. A lot of things we could do. Should we do that? And here comes the other issue. Who gets them, as I said? Do we decide who gets them? Who is we? You? Me? Some committee? Do the individuals decide that they should get them? Is there some quasi-calculus that says that individuals who are experiencing or exhibiting certain characteristics or traits, insufficiencies, abnorms, they should get these things? And if in fact that's the case, well, obviously they need to consent, but how informed is their consent? We've argued, my group, together with others internationally, have argued that one of the fundamental contingencies for consent is the provision of information whether or not there's going to be continuity of research to determine if, in fact, things are going wrong or going well, and care if, in fact, things go wrong or go well, so as to make sure things continue to go well, so these individuals are not rendered, quote, obsolete in any way, given version 2.0, 3.0, 4.0 of the science and technology that they may or may not be able to get. Just by saying that, the social burden of this responsibility to be able to maintain that level of contingency to assure the probity of consent is huge. Are we ready for that? Socially, politically, economically? I can tell you by some of the work of my colleague and I, Professor John Shook, the answer to the question is no, we are not. Some work that we had done a few years back, a paper that is entitled Neuroethics Beyond Normal, we not only looked at some of the issues that you just raised in terms of, well, if everybody gets these, then the threshold shifts, which means we're going to need something more. Or if only some are so capabilized, well, what do we do to those who are not? In other words, what does this do to the proverbial schism between those who are neurotechnologically capabilized and those who are not? What are the limits? What are the asymptotes? What are the ceilings on such levels of enablement, optimization, and or enhancement? How far should we go, so to speak? And how do we decide who gets these things and who doesn't get these things? And how do we treat those who do and don't? I want to refer your listeners, your audience, to a very, very interesting piece of fiction. It's written by a fellow named Daniel Wilson. The name of the book is Amped, A-M-P-E-D. Absolutely brilliant. I mean, it's so good. I wish I'd written it. I mean, it's a wonderful, wonderful book. And, very often the thing is, there's an interesting exchange between fiction and fact, life imitating art, imitating life. And this is, I think, that dual face of Janus writ large. We have the technologies that Wilson speaks about in his book, those technologies capable of altering the cognitive capabilities of individuals, although Wilson allows some, if you will, literary license to be able to go a bit further in the proximate future. The novel, the fiction, the morality play has nothing to do with the science. It has to do with the social manifestations of who's gotten the science and what that then means to be enabled to do what others do. Because initially, I did not possess those capabilities. So what happens now when we shift, if you will, those measures of central tendency of mean, median, and mode to create relative uniformities or provide capabilities, and now we shift the entire balance, the equilibrium of the human capability, if you will, niche, market, milieu. It's a lot.
And then, I mean, like, what happens when you have, like, say, psychopathic leaders who may choose to forego the whole question of consent? I mean, we are assuming that we as a collective humanity can agree on what consent is. But what if they don't? What if consent is disregarded and whole populations are, genetically altered?
Well, you're right. You're right. I mean, let's face it. I mean, we tend to view consent as something that is important within the construct of a relative libertarian orientation to the individuality and individual autonomy. But that's not uniform globally. I mean, really, I mean, in a more collectivist culture that has a collectivist philosophy and ethos, the individual is, in fact, not only participatory and contribute to the collective, but is part of the collective. Ergo, what is good for the collective is what's good for the individual. And it isn't as if there's some arm twisting or arm bending that goes along with that. That represents, if you will, the social cultural narrative. As a result, that's the narrative that is obtained, and that is the narrative that is entailed. So in cultures that are more exclusively collectivist rather than individualistic, the concept of consent can be something as simple as, this is good for us as a people. Since you're one of the people and your identity is as whatever this people is, good for you, right? Good. Moreover, there may be something that is far less proximate. One of the long-standing kind of ideals of the West, all right, what used to be called the West, is something that a colleague of mine, Dr. Roland Benedictor at the Urac Center in Bozen, Bolzano, has discussed with regard to the focus upon the individual. In other words, idiosyncratic identity. But the truth of the issue is that in a collectivist culture, idiosyncratic identity is folded into systemic identity, cultural identity. And the lifespan of the individual is far less important in the grand scheme of things than, if you will, the sustainability of the system or the sustainability of the collective. Because what's seen is sort of a generational outlook. Right? That's neither good nor bad. It's just what it is. But the entire perspective changes when one switches from something that is proximate to something that is more distal, to that which is sort of more tactically and idiosyncratically oriented, to that which is more strategic and systemically oriented. And so as a consequence, you're getting whole modes of distinction in the way these things are being appreciated, perceived, and therefore articulated, which I think certainly need to be at least addressed, if not respected.
So, like, for example, you have a benevolent dictator. I mean, I guess this is the question, isn't it? Is this benevolent dictator able to just implement all these particular technologies? Like, is there this technology right now to wirelessly? I mean, I think this is the thing of conspiracy, but is a whole 5G network really going up and able to, control
Well,
society and implant ideas? I mean, I think, can we even go there? Like, do people, is that available right now? Like, are we, or is that something that is just of science fiction right at this moment in time?
well, so again, let's define what is science fiction, and let's also discuss what is in fact science potentiality. All right, science fiction is exactly that. It's fictional, and very often science fiction begins from a premise of non-realizability. In other words, I could think time travel. I have no idea of how I can engage time travel. I mean, I could think miniaturizing myself down, and then getting myself down to the size of an atom. No mechanism for that. But there's also the idea of literary scientific potentiality. And again, I hearken back here to, I mean, there's a number of very, very good books and fictional works that speak to this, particularly in the neural context. I mean, we can take a look back several decades and take a look at some of the work, for example, Flowers for Algernon. All right. I mean, an excellent, excellent book, originally a short story, then expanded into a book and ultimately made it into a movie that was called Charlie here in the United States, starring Cliff Robertson. Neuromancer, for example, an excellent book. Once again, amped. And there are others. I mean, if we wanted to talk about the role of neuroscience fiction, we could spend literally an hour just on that. It's fascinating. But I think what we're really talking about here is what's on the proverbial drawing board, both in terms of intent as well as under development. And of course, one of the things we're talking about being under development is this N cubed project that involves the use of nanoscalar material that can be introduced into the brain non-surgically, that then can create these vast arrays of sensing and transmitting electrodes. That's not science fiction. That is a planned project that is underway. And in full transparency, I served for a time as one of the consulting neuroethicists to that project. Now, again, the issue behind that project is that this is a gate-kept project. In other words, this project is being used for specific means, those means being primarily biomedical, in some cases also being used for other ways of implementation, particularly for monitoring. And again, we're talking about monitoring, we're talking about specific individuals. And is also being entertained for the possibility of could this also be then used for those individuals who have other forms of what are considered to be sociocultural impediments. In other words, these individuals have long-standing physical conditions that render them incapable of getting out into the real world. Could we then link them to computational interfaces, et cetera, and do so non-surgically to reduce surgical risks? But even those what we've considered to be viable uses are laden with ethical and legal issues, each of which need to be considered before, during, and even after these things are developed. These things are not yet developed. You can already hear what your audience is saying. Wait a minute. This is DARPA, and the D in DARPA stands for Darth Vader, so they're already dropping these things in people's heads. I'm here to tell you, to the best of my knowledge, these things are not being dropped into people's heads. These things aren't being made into little aerosols you can then spray into a room, and now everyone has these electrodes. The government is controlling their brain. But is that possible? Would that be possible? Yes. Which is why I don't discourage what I will call collective republic concern.
Mhm.
But what I do encourage is to avoid neuro nonsense. Let's be very, very concerned about the actual capabilities that science and technology possess, inclusive of their evolution over the next 5 years. Let's be really concerned about that. Let's be concerned to the point of who's controlling the technology. Is it being commercialized? How is it being commercialized? And all the issues that go along with that. Let's not sort of forego the idea of worrying about the rain and the possibility of a real storm by confusing ourselves as saying the sky is falling. The sky isn't falling, but it looks like rain.
Yeah.
So the idea here is, okay, let's not lament the sky falling and be Chicken Little, but let's be far more appropriate to say, well, might I need my galoshes, a raincoat, an umbrella, or do I need to batten down the hatches? And what do I need to do in preparation for this? What's going to be necessary to be able to be aware of this, stay aware of the science, the real science. Look, science fiction is wonderful. And I've been a big fan of science fiction since I was a little kid, still am. But I think what becomes very important is you can get lost in the science fiction, and as a consequence, you get distracted from science fact. Let's stay focal on the science fact for that which is going to be our exercise and our effort. And let's use the science fiction as viable entertainment, but also as illustration of what could be possibilities if the science fact gets out of hand.
How do they actually do the research for this to know that these things work? Like, are individuals coming forward and saying collectively, experiment on me? You know, like who are the people who are willing to go into that frontier? I mean, I think this is particularly interesting.
Yeah, I mean, it is.
How we get to this point.
Yeah, well, I mean, so certainly, I mean, I can vouch for the fact that here in the United States and among our scientific and technologically allied countries who are our international collaborators, the idea of informed consent for participation in research is paramount. I mean, those things that came out of, if you will, came out of Nuremberg in the late 1940s, 1947, 1948, after the doctor's trial, that was ultimately folded into the Belmont Report that became the standards of what the Public Health Service here in the United States utilizes as the codes for responsible research, put as paramount the autonomy of the individual to be able to decline participation, not only in the research, but to actually withdraw from the research at any particular time for whatever reason without penalty. And again, we're talking about the United States and our international collaborators and what I would call our international economic, scientific, and technological allies. Where it gets to be somewhat difficult is, again, as I mentioned earlier, that there are other cultures for which those levels, those stringencies of consent and the relative importance of individual autonomy are not as much of a factor, given the fact that it's a collectivist philosophy and ethos. So we have to appreciate that. And in some cases, I'll tell you, those capabilities of having sort of a much broader ethical net, if you will, different ethical net, can accelerate research and development.
Mm.
And as a consequence, the issue then becomes what we, all the collective we, must consider is, let's just say that there is a neuroscientific and technological development that reaches the global stage that is profound. I mean, absolutely profound. Something, for example, that is able to not only cure, but perhaps prevent stroke. Um, One of the most devastating forms of brain cancer. It's glioblastoma multiforme, GBM. I mean, it's an absolutely devastating and rapidly spreading brain cancer that grows like a dandelion, right? Invariably fatal. So what if tomorrow Nation X came to the stage and said, you know, we have developed not only a cure for this, but a preventive treatment for this? The line would be around the block. This is great. And then what if it became evident through some due diligence that the research that was done to be able to get to this earth-shatteringly beneficent development didn't conform to the ethical standards that we hold near and dear? Would we embrace it? Would we deny it? Would we seek in some way to, quote, usurp that technology or that development and make it, quote, our own? Would we feel the need to go back and repeat the research when, in fact, now individuals are dying as a consequence of non-availability of what has become a demonstrated cure? So I use this as an exemplar because although it's very easy for us to say, oh, no, 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 you know, if there's improbity or if there's any kind of divergence to these ethical standards, no, no, we instantly go to the Amy Winehouse mode. No, no, no.
Yeah.
Unless, unless. So again, I think what becomes important is the realization that neuroscience and technology is being conducted in a multinational milieu. B, that the multinational milieu establishes that other cultures, other nations have distinct histories, have distinct needs, values, philosophies, and perhaps ethics. In some cases, those ethics are more permissive. C, that more permissive ethics may in fact create certain latitudes that in some cases can advance the science and technology. And D, we, the cumulative we, the global we, must be ready for these realities and prepared to deal with them in very, very real ways. And that doesn't always necessarily mean frankly refuting them, particularly if, in fact, what comes out of those enterprises and endeavors is something that can be seen by consensus as uniformly beneficial. By the same token, we have to also consider Well, what are certain research practices that have benevolent intent, but that could go bad like that? Case in point, something like gain of function research that, as I'm sure you and all of your listeners now know, was at least contributory in part to the possibility of developing the form of the SARS virus that ultimately led to COVID.
Mm.
Do we have the constraints in place? Do we have the safeguards in place? If they're in place, are they ratified? Are they surveilled? Are they maintained? Are they governed? All of these things, I think, need to come to the fore as part of the internationalizable discourse and reality as the science and technology becomes ever more capable. And not only ever more capable, but in some cases, we become more culpable or at least complicit in the way the science and technology is used, not used, misused, or abused.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a very good question, answer there, especially when you consider that when we were talking before about population-wide, it's not happening. Nanotechnology is not being injected into people, it's not being sprayed or aerosolized, and 5G is not being turned on. But potentially some culture out there, some country out there might have tried doing such an experiment on, say, a remote village or somewhere where out of the view of the scientific community, and come up with
Well,
certain results, and we wouldn't really know, would we?
agreed. And you know, if you want to go one step further, if you want to know what keeps me up at night, I mean, truly, people say, "Oh, what do you worry about?" I mean, other than like the fact that we're poised in an election here in the United States, it could be rather interesting, one way or the other. What do I worry about? I'm not so much even worried about the fact that nation states may be engaged in some of this stuff, because nation states executing this on some level have, I think, particular constraints with regard to attribution. Right? Yes, there are ways that nation states can engage activities that are clandestine, at least in covert at most. But the other possibility that really, really worries me is the use of is the leverage of these techniques and use of these techniques by non-state actors. And there's a number of ways that can happen. That can happen by intent, where a particular nation state says, look, we've developed something, we developed this thing, but we really don't want to be attributable for it. Therefore, we're going to establish a set of proxies. And what we'll do is we'll let the proxies engage the utility and see how it goes, sort of testing the waters, so forth. The other possibility is that non-state actors can get hold of either the technology, the plans for the technology, or various substrates, and then they can leverage that technology in those ways that can be at very least capricious, if not nefarious. And then the other issue there too is that what can happen here once again is that particularly individuals operating between or within national sovereignties can then incur particular effects, which can then get runaway effects, where the technology or the science literally runs away from them because they were operating between sovereignties and not necessarily guided or governed by this set of regulations or that set of regulations, but they were essentially working between and allowing these various latitudes to then exacerbate what research capabilities they had. And the cat proverbially gets out of the bag before they were ready to release the kitty. And so these are the scenarios that worry me, along with the usual what state actors are doing and what sort of latitude state actors may take, and can we be able to develop the necessary institutions and procedures for this type of discourse and dialectic. So, you know, again, not to necessarily impart worry on your listening audience, but rather to appraise them of the reality of the situation, which is not simple. It is indeed complex. And let's face it, complex questions and issues require detailed and complex solution sets. And so there is no easy fix. It's going to take work. But at the end of the day, I've argued in print, and I'll do so here again unapologetically. I truly think that the juice is worth the squeeze. I think that the result of spending the time, effort, and monies necessary to develop this discourse and dialectic is certainly worth it, because to do otherwise, I think, would be foolhardy.
And I think we don't really have a choice, do we?
We always have a choice. I mean,
I mean, like
I think we
if we
always have a
want to
choice.
see civilization flourish, we really do need to discuss this very important topic of where neuroscience is going and how we manage all of that.
Well, I
And
agree.
I think you've got a few books. Is that not right? You've got a few books out there that you've
Do,
written on that
do.
would give the reader, the listeners here, more in-depth information, I guess, as to where
do.
your research
I
is
do.
taking you.
And what I would really, I mean, this is the part of our broadcast that becomes the unabashed self-promotional plug. And once again,
Yes.
I do so. And so I have two books forthcoming. They're both coming out probably in fall of 2024. One is being published by MIT Press. And that's with my colleague, Dr. John Shook. And it's looking at neuroethics 2.0, the idea of engaging sort of brain science on the social stage. And then another is written with my colleague John Shook and my international colleague Dr. Roland Benedictor, and it's to be published by Springer. And that's really looking at the idea of neurocultures. In other words, how neuroscience and neurotechnologies have influenced culture and how culture has influenced the neurosciences. Again, both of those books forthcoming in fall of 2024.
And have you got other particular books you've already written on this particular subject?
Yeah, for sure. So, I mean, if your readers want to go to my Amazon webpage, for example, simply look up James Giordano on Amazon, and my available books over the past decade plus 15, 20 years are available. The books on neuroethics, neurotechnology and national defense, brain injury, neuroscience and neurotechnology affecting the human condition, the way we feel pleasure and pain. So they're available on Amazon or directly through the publisher.
Okay, so I'll just finish with this. Science is more than society based on scientific technology that nobody understands is a combustible mixture of ignorance and power. So I just wanted to leave that last quote line here, and that if you wanted to add anything else to our interview today, to the audience, any final words?
I love that quote. I think it's brilliant that you brought that quote up. And I think that the important part of that quote is that we've already lit the fuse. We've already lit that fuse. Now it's a question of whether or not we use that combustion in those ways that are going to provide light and heat, those things that provide combustion from movement, or those things that are going to be explosive and destructive. At the end of the day, it's up to us.
Yes, I mean, it's incredible the potential that we have here. And of course, with anything that has great potential, there's always the flip side of that being great harm. And you can't have one without the other. It goes with any development, I guess, any progress in technology. There is always that advantage that someone has, and we have to navigate that brave new world. So thank you very much, Professor Giordano, for coming and joining us today. As I said to everyone, we will have all the links to your books, to your CV. It'll be in the it will be in the description and on our website. And any questions you can forward through our website, and I'll hopefully be able to get them to you. Normally, I think we usually sum it up quite well here. So I think, there's a lot of things that a lot of research people can go down with the books that you've and the links that we'll provide for them to delve into this topic a lot more, which, I mean, it is a huge topic. Probably spend years on it and still not really fully understand it. But I think we all need to make a start, really. So this is why we've brought this topic up here. I think it's a very, very important subject, and where society will go with it. Thank you very much.
Thank you.